Wars have always been personal for me on a wide and sweeping spectrum. Human suffering, hardship, and death brings out sympathies and empathies, no matter the place. Conflicts like the Russo-Ukrainian War or the Civil War in Myanmar trigger the humanity in me that is blind to the details of the context and circumstances. Suffering is suffering, death is death. And as an observer to the sides involved in these wars, it's generally always sad and infuriating. Now, as wars come closer to home and start to register further emotions, wars where there's an increased sense of belonging, the intensity of the sentiments escalates. The Syrian crisis, the Gaza genocide, Libya's ongoing struggle, Sudan's civil war, and Yemen's brutally long conflict all begin to have added impact on one's emotional and rational equation. And then, when war hits home, as in the tri-party war between the United States, Israel, and Iran, when it's your own native country, Kuwait, facing the consequences of an adjacent war forced upon it, a war not of its own choosing, then the emotions amplify further. The entire array of sentiments and fears, analysis and deduction serve as the inputs in this newer formula that can sway one's mind from one extreme to another. This is the struggle. The Iran war is a very complex composite of so many superimposed factors and resultant emotions. Virtually a three-body problem that's extremely difficult to resolve with its unpredictable moving parts, involving the American-Israeli allied aggression, Iran's existential reactionary expansive effort, and the consequentially targeted bystanders, the Gulf nations. The roles in this conflict are dynamic, constantly changing and evolving. There's an aggressor and then there's a victim. Then that victim becomes an aggressor, justifiably so, toward those who had committed the original aggression, but in parallel, unjustly, with their further aggression towards those who had nothing to do with the triggering events.
Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime. Regime change was not our goal. We never said regime change, but regime change has occurred. My opinion that they were going to attack first. They were going to attack. If we didn't do it, they were going to attack first. I felt strongly about that. They've rejected every opportunity to renounce their nuclear ambitions, and we can't take it anymore.
But the objective of this mission is the destruction of their ballistic missile capabilities and of their naval capabilities.
We're going to bring them back to the Stone Ages where they belong.
Then you have the overall ever-changing narratives of regime change, nuclear non-proliferation, or weapons of mass destruction emanating from the first aggressor, the Americans, or the confusing counter-narratives by the subsequent aggressor, Iran, in justifying its own reactions.
The responsibility for these attacks lies not only with those who carried out those attacks, but also with those who facilitated, supported, and encouraged them.
Hence this confusion. Each relationship between one party and the next offers an isolated analysis and resultant conclusion and emotion. America and Israel attack Iran again. That's no good. I feel for the Iranian people. Iran retaliates and hits Israel and the US Navy, totally understandable and rightful as per international law. Iran hits US bases across the Arab world. Passable only if attacks on Iran emanated from these bases, and if not, then totally unacceptable. Israel and the United States carelessly target Iranian civilian infrastructure like oil and gas fields, power and desalination plants. Not acceptable and a war crime. Iran, in response, targets the same Gulf infrastructure. Also unacceptable and a war crime. Hezbollah, Iran's proxy, attacking Israel in response is acceptable in responding to the latter's invasion of southern Lebanon. But then you remember that Iran is also activating silent terrorist cells in your native country, and so it's not acceptable any longer. Agreement or disagreement within these isolated events is this unsolvable problem, and hence causing all sorts of pushes and pulls. When looked at in isolation, one's conclusions can appear rational and clear. But when you combine all these elements together, the larger picture becomes much foggier and more undefinable. Let's lay out these elements that entangle the overall picture. First, it's the same old American hegemony and Israeli impunity that are difficult to swallow, again and again, reckless and without accountability. Even if the target is Iran, an interventionist player in West Asia, there's no justifying the invasion and annihilation of any country or its people by another, period. Let's say there is justification for this war. Where is the foresight in planning the various scenarios that would ensue upon the first attacks on Iran? Would Iran retaliate with aerial attacks on the Gulf states? Israel obviously couldn't care less. Was this part of the war game exercises in DC? Was there a scenario studied when the lion's share of Iranian missile and drone attacks would be directed toward the neighboring and more easily targeted Gulf, who suffer some 83% of all Iranian aerial bombardment? With this analysis, what's apparent is that the United States has left its Gulf allies out to dry by imposing on them a war without consultation or coordination, considering them an acceptable victim that they and their ally Israel happily see weakened across the board, from a political, economic, and most importantly, security standpoint, thus negatively impacting their prosperity and, most importantly, sense of safety.
Panic, chaos, and injuries at the Dubai airport overnight.
This serves Israel, that's for sure. But all for what? To satisfy the Zionist lobby? Or its aging neocon political elite and their military complex influence? Or was it for larger goals such as the crippling of the Chinese and their economy, who depend on approximately 50% of their oil imports from the Gulf? Especially now, since the United States has secured its own Western Hemisphere oil repository.
We have to be surrounded by safe, secure countries, and we also have to have energy.
Now, if we look at the factors from the other side, Iran has repeatedly made empty and disingenuous statements that they would only target American bases that were utilized in American attacks on its territories. All Gulf nations explicitly stated upon the initial American phases of the war that none of the bases on their lands had been used.
لقد تعرضت دولتنا لاعتداء غاشم من دولة جارة مسلمة نعدها صديقة على الرغم من أننا لم نسمح باستخدام أراضينا أو أجوائنا أو سواحلنا في أي عمل عسكري ضدها.
For argument's sake and in avoiding the naivete label, let's say maybe some bases were used. Then why subsequently target civilian infrastructure like airports, electrical stations, hotels, and residential communities? Tit for tat is no excuse. And when we look deeper at these justifications of attacks on Gulf nations due to the hosting of American bases, you realize how contradictory and unbelievable these excuses are. Iranians themselves, for longer than any American presence in the Gulf, have been the promoters of militia proxies and violence in bases across the Arab world. Generally, the instigators of instability in nations such as Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Now, if we flip back and look again at the American side and on the topic of American bases, you'd think their presence would guarantee some level of protection to the Gulf from Iranian attacks. But no. It's been wishful thinking on behalf of the Gulf nations that the United States would protect them in the same way it does Israel. No Iron Dome 2.0 exists here. Gulf countries must go at it on their own and suffer the consequences. A further completely frustrating and unbelievable development born of the Iran war is the recent repositioning by Iran of the highly difficult Strait of Hormuz into a Panama or Suez Canal-like commodity. How can anyone consider a water channel sovereign when it's not even bordered entirely by one single nation? 3 nations on the Gulf, to be exact, have borders on the strait. And now, due to the actions of the United States, we're now negotiating how Iran has a potential right to perpetually charge for its crossing.
They can monetize passage through the Strait of Hormuz and make countries pay for access to the strait. That wasn't true before. That's not something they're going to unlearn, and I think it's a new normal we're going to have to live with.
I really do appreciate you taking the time and watching the Kennedy Chronicles. Please do join our community by subscribing so that you don't miss out on any content regarding the Arab and Muslim history, identity, and modern condition. And if you really do enjoy the channel week in and week out and would like to support us even further, please do join us at our YouTube membership program as well as on Patreon. Thanks again. You might be sensing my frustrations a little here. It's because this whole war is very personal, because it pushes and pulls with the various players involved and their interrelationships. How one cannot look at this war in isolation without looking at the happenings across all of West Asia in unison. But there are a few absolute findings. I'm against Zionist Israel in any and everything it projects outside its 1967 borders. Full stop. I'm against the unilateral and conceited approach of the United States in the region. The enemy Iran of an enemy Israel definitely does not automatically suggest that they're either a friend or an enemy. What's clear is that they're both aggressors in the books. Who once might have been considered an ally of circumstance, the United States, has left my nation exposed and stressed. And this is where the contradictions and subsequent worries lie. We witness a bulging, fanatic attitude of Zionists acting freely in the region with no one holding them in check, usurping Arab land and with a clear and open proclamation to the lands that shape their understanding and intention of a greater Israel. The conclusion here is that there needs to exist a balancing power willing to stand in Israel's way. We hear a preached America first United States, but really recognize that it's Israel first, then America. At least America has been consistent in this for the past decades. But also we see an America that recently has steadily and increasingly promised an isolationist withdrawal back to its Monroe Doctrine and along the Prime Meridian. We see Iran, a country who could be a power player in the region, confronting Israel proper and providing a strong opponent to Israel's hegemonic ambitions. But instead, a country that meddles in the affairs of its Muslim brothers, causing all sorts of strife. Yet at the same time, I see its people killed and suffering, and hence draws out my empathy. On the slightly brighter side, there's a major lesson here amongst all the complication and confusion for me and my people, the Gulf in this case. And it's clearer than ever. What the Gulf nations must learn is that no one has their back. Neither the Western partners that have sold them out on the cheap to a nation that keeps dragging them into regional, existentially necessary wars, nor the institutions of international laws or the supposedly civilized Western nations that have let them down time and time again. Not even other Arab nations who have repeatedly professed their proclamations in protecting their Arab brethren from any foreign attack. No one is to be trusted.
أنا دايما أقول تهديد أي دولة عربية جيش مصر جيش عظيم وطني قوي صحيح بس هو زي ما قلت قوة عاقلة ولكن بالظبط كده مسافة السكة أيوة المسافة فين المشكلة فين التهديد فين والتهديد قد إيه مسافة السكة دي هتلاقونا موجودين.
So who can be trusted? Well, only themselves. This is a watershed moment when equations change, where blind alliances must be carefully and thoroughly examined. Years ago, in the early 1980s, the members of the Gulf had a very powerful vision, the Gulf Cooperation Council. The regional intergovernmental alliance comprising of all 6 states was created. It laid the foundations for political, economic, and security cooperation. And as time elapsed, its momentum came to a stop, as the various Gulf nations followed different and individual paths towards sovereignty and prosperity. I believe it's time to turn the clock back to the time of the Arab Spring when Saudi Arabia called for a more structured union, possibly a federation. It's happened before in the Gulf. Look at the United Arab Emirates, itself a nation built upon 7 smaller sheikdoms. This aspiration would entail becoming a larger and more powerful geopolitical and sovereign entity that can rely on its own human capital, crucial for sustainability and prosperity. Imagine the results: a population of 60 million with a GDP of over 4 trillion, taking it to 7th on the list of countries by GDP. This, though, would be the easy part. What's tougher to do is to unite in creating a diplomatic force that can command relevance and presence, both regionally and internationally. Sovereignty and independence must be returned to the Gulf lands. No foreign bases necessary anymore. In the same way that Iran cannot be allowed to impose any control over the Strait of Hormuz or any lands outside its domain. And any total dependence and reliance on a small geographic bottleneck like the Strait that can cripple the GDP lifeline of almost every nation in the Gulf should not remain the status quo any longer. What's even more critical strategically and difficult to do is the shift of a certain mindset to start getting serious about the reality on the ground, namely toward absolute security, towards the ability to confront any threat that might present itself, current or future, from any direction, be it Iran down the line or Israel upon wanting to exercise its assumed hegemony, or toward any other future threat. In every scenario of the Iran war, this three-body problem, the outcome never changes. Whether it's Iran capitulating, and it won't, or if Iran succeeds in holding firm, which it will, the United States announcing its self-aggrandizing fake victory in the war and independently ceasing to engage further, or if it's Israel continuing to obliterate Iran's fabric, these scenarios and all others will lead to the same conclusion, that it's over. The fat lady has sung, over and over and over again. This false sense of security over the entire Arabian Peninsula has been exposed, on every single level, on the political, economic, and security levels. Let's call it what it is. The Gulf was never the owner of its present or future. Maybe now, this is the moment that ownership changes hands.